You're listening to the Maritime Gardening Podcast, episode 86, brought to you by Vessi Seeds and Safest Gardening Products. Well, folks, it is July 27th as I record this here today, and it's a beautiful, warm, sunny day outside. I think it's 31 degrees Celsius in my backyard right now, probably a degree or two warmer in my garden because it's just so pleasant in that spot. And I thought I would do an episode today speaking to every conceivable question that has been thrown at me since I changed the walking paths in my garden from having wood chips to having sand pathways. So for those that aren't aware of the configuration of my garden, I got beds where I grow stuff, and I got walking paths where I walk, and I do not walk on my beds. And in the walking paths, instead of having grass that I have to mow or something like that, for the last X number of years, I have just laid down wood chips every year. Every year a guy comes and dumps a whole bunch of wood chips in my driveway, and then I put them in a wheelbarrow and bring them down to the garden and arrange them in the walking paths, and that suppresses weeds. It also just has this nice soft sort of dry place to kneel and so on and so forth. And this year, instead of getting another load of wood chips to put in the pathways, I put down sand. And how did I arrive at that decision to go from wood chips to sand? The area where I live has recently become indicated as an area where there's a risk of the ticks that carry Lyme disease. And based on my reading and even a podcast I did here with Dr. Vet Lloyd of Mount Allison University, you go back a few episodes, you'll find that podcast. She's a scientist or a professor at a university who studies ticks and in particular Lyme disease. And she was saying that the very, very tiny, small juvenile ticks, the ones that tend to give people Lyme disease because no one ever notices when they're on your body, those ticks like the environment of wood chips and leaves and stuff like that. I was always of the frame of mind that by using wood chips I was tick proof, because my experience as an angler, normally when you're fishing, your main risk of getting ticks is when you're walking through grass, is like a knee-high grass. That tends to be when ticks attach themselves to your pants and stuff like that. Whenever you walk through a bit of grass, you take a look at your knees and your thighs, and you'll tend to find ticks, and you pick them off right away. So I always thought I was okay because I don't have any grass in my walking paths. I got these wood chips. But she said that the juvenile ticks, the ones that attach themselves to mice and voles and moles and things like that, squirrels, that they have got no problem hanging out in wood chips and leaves and stuff like that, leaf matter, and that you're at risk, according to what she was saying, if you're using that as a means to mulch. So I decided, and everything she was saying was consistent with a good deal of the reading I'd been doing on this topic. I'm not saying that if you have wood chips, you're going to get ticks. There's a risk, that's all. There's a risk. And since I'm out in my garden, I'm always kneeling in that and sitting in that and wallowing around in it sort of thing. And since I've got kids out there, I'm really most concerned about them. And my wife goes out there as well. Imagine saddling a young person with Lyme disease at a young age, how that would affect their life, let alone having your spouse contract that illness or yourself, right? It's just all awful. So I thought that by putting down sand in the pathways, that would mitigate that risk and not necessarily make it 100% tick-proof, but reduce the amount of habitat in the garden that is favorable to ticks. Everything Vet Lloyd was telling me, I floated the idea by her of using sand, and she said that's really good because they need to stay moist, and the sand would dehydrate them. It's not an environment they like, so you'd be safe using sand. It's just not an environment they enjoy. So I took the plunge, and I got a dump truck load of sand in my driveway, and I hired a young fella to help me out because it's really hard moving sand, and I did all that, and that was about 2 months ago, and I'm totally happy with the results. I still miss the wood chips in lots of different ways, but anyway, there's been I've done 2 videos on this the day I did it, and I was explaining why I did it, and I did a follow-up video very recently. You can check those out. But I've had a lot of questions about it, and I decided to just line up all of those questions. I mean, not every single question, but the ones that I think are The ones I can answer and I have something to say that seem like a kind of, I mean, I'm using my own judgment here, so if I don't address your question here, don't be offended. It's just the questions I think most people would want to know the answer to, that weren't just some trolling flame fest, which does happen on YouTube sometimes. So so let's plunge it. Let's dive into it. Let's get into it here. Let's get stuck in and go with these questions. So first question. I'm not naming any names here. I'm just reading off the questions. So if you're a regular viewer and you threw this question out, then hopefully you recognize the question you asked, and this is the answer to your question. So the first one is, I'm curious to see if the local cats take a liking to it, referring to all the sand. And that's not the only question. A number of people asked about, oh my goodness, the cats. If I did that, the cats in my neighborhood would go crazy. And well, number one, for my garden, to speak to that, it's all fenced in. So I don't really have the cats aren't really getting in there. I guess they could climb the fence, but they don't tend to do that because there's nothing in there they're really interested in. But the part of my garden that's outside the enclosure, which the cats can get to, and there's a couple cats that people that were in my neighborhood are crazy to let their cats out because there's wild animals, wild cats, raccoons, coyotes. They eat cats for breakfast. So I think anyone here that lets their cats roam the streets is probably going to be donating a cat to the coyote population here. But anyway, there are cats around. There's one white cat that's always in my lawn, and that must be the toughest, savviest cat in the world, because it's a rough neighborhood for wild things here. Anyway, I have a herb garden that has sand. I've got a fire pit that's all sand. Basically, you're sitting by a fire with your feet in the sand, almost like being on a beach. And I've got almost like a deck type thing behind my house that I've used sand on as well. So I got sand everywhere. And every once in a while, I'll get a little bit of cat poop, and I just pick it up with a shovel or whatever and flick it in the woods. It's not really a big deal. It's not like every day I have to go out and shovel gallons of cat poop. I mean, maybe once every other week there's a turd in my sand. For me, it's not a big deal, and I don't care. Maybe for other people that would be a big deal. Or I can imagine if the thing was covered in cat poop, that would be a problem. But at least where I am, and again, I'm not in a suburban area. Maybe I would get a little bit more if I was. But I don't mind scooping up a little cat poop and flicking it into the woods if it means that there's a greater or a lesser risk of getting ticks and especially Lyme disease in my garden. So that's my answer to that. Another comment here, someone said, sand here gets infested by ants pretty intensely. And that's not the only comment I've had about ants. And actually people are always, even when I had wood chips in my gardens, people would say, don't the ants like that? And people have seen that I have hugelkultur beds which have wood buried in them. People have said, doesn't that bring the ants around? And people have seen that my beds are bordered with old rotten logs and stuff like that. And they said, oh, doesn't that give you ants? And the answer to all of those questions is yes. I have ants in my garden. I have ants everywhere in my garden. If you go, and every once in a while, I'll just go sit out in my garden and have a cold beer and just have a look at everything. Just be quiet and look at the garden and see what's going on. And it doesn't take long for your eyes to take notice of ants. There's ants everywhere in my garden. Probably at least 3 different kinds of ants in my garden. I got little tiny black ones. I got those ones that have the red part in the middle, and at least one other kind. So I've got ants all over my garden, and as far as I can tell, they don't really do anything bad. I suppose the worst thing they do is if plants get aphids on them, they tend to protect the aphids and look after them. But that's easily solved by just killing the aphids. Just spray some insecticide. There's lots of different ways to deal with it. People just blast them with the hose or whatever, but I don't mess around. I got a little bit of insecticidal soap, paraffin-based insecticidal soap, and I just blast them with that, and the aphids are gone, and the ants got no aphids to look after, so they go back to doing whatever it is ants do when they're not taking care of aphids. So yes, I have ants, and I don't care. It's not a big problem. I suppose if you had the kind of ants that bite, or fire ants or whatever, if you had those kind of ants, that might be a problem. But I don't seem to have anything. I just got carpenter ants and garden ants and the kind of ants that tend to persist in the ecosystem here, and they don't really do anything negative to my plants. I've got lots of things. I was just out looking at my eggplant this morning, and I pulled back a bit of the mulch there, and there was ant eggs everywhere. And I'm sure people might think that's gross or whatever, but it doesn't affect the plants. I've even done videos where I've dug up potatoes, and the potatoes are growing in with ants and with ant eggs. Doesn't do nothing. So, I mean, I'm sure there might be types of ants somewhere that are a problem. You know, somewhere. I don't know. I don't have that kind of ant. Kind of ants I have in my garden, not a problem. So, yes, I do have some ants, and perhaps they like the sand. I don't really know. I don't feel that I have any more now than I had before. But what I do know, at least in my experience, is that they don't do anything bad. So I don't worry about them. If anything, they probably take out, I'm sure they prey on things that might be a problem. That's possible. They certainly work the soil. They create a lot of tunnels in the soil. And if you've got little insects putting tunnels in your soil, that allows the water to get down into your soil, into your roots. So I think they're beneficial, or at the very least neutral, with respect to maintaining a vegetable garden, at least the kind of ants I have in my garden. I hope that answers your question. Another question: did you rake and remove all the wood chips before adding the sand? I don't know about all the wood chips, but as you know, as much as I could. I had a young fellow here, and we both went at it pretty hard. We spent about 3 hours scraping off as much of the existing wood chips we could. It seemed a shame to take such a useful mulch and just bury it forever. So yeah, I removed, I don't know how many, maybe 12 wheelbarrow fulls of wood chips from the walking paths, and used them on various gardens elsewhere on the property and in the vegetable garden. The front of my house, I've got some ornamental gardens, you know, some daylilies and stuff like that. So a lot of the wood chips that were in my garden went on those because I needed to mulch them anyway, and it was just a easy, cheap way to do it, right? And I had a young guy here that was able to do all the hard work, so it seemed to make perfect sense to me. So yes, I did. You know, it wouldn't make sense to bury that under sand. Another question here. I wonder how this would affect, they're talking about the sand pathways. I wonder how this would affect slugs. It seems as though slugs wouldn't like to travel through sand and maybe reduce slug populations. Yeah, that makes sense. And perhaps they don't like traveling through the sand. I mean, some slugs, a lot of different kinds of slugs travel underground as well. So perhaps they just travel under the sand. I don't know. I didn't notice any difference in the spring. That is to say, at least for this year, I had just as many slugs and snails as I always had. I've got them in my gardens. Now, I mean, who knows? Maybe next year will be different. I know I had a robin. I didn't film this because I didn't want to upset the chicks, but I had a robin build a robin's nest and raise 3 chicks right next to my garden. The nest was actually at eye level. So I know a lot of slugs went to feeding those chicks, slugs and snails and stuff like that. So yeah, I don't know. Well, I'll have to see over time. It seems logical to me that they wouldn't like traveling over the sand, that's for sure. So if you've got an X amount in each particular bed, and they can't go from bed to bed, and they're maybe less inclined to migrate in from the outside, perhaps any given bed, the population can be reduced by the activity of birds and toads and garter snakes. And of course, very early in the season, April, May, I use the Safer's, what's it called, slug and snail killer. It's just a slug bait I've talked about before on the show. It's relatively benign if you're concerned about whether your garden's organic or not. I consider my garden to be an organic garden, despite the fact that I use this stuff, because all it really breaks down to is things that are naturally occurring in the soil anyway. After X number of weeks. So those various chemical compounds, iron and sulfur and stuff like that, these are all things that exist in nature anyway, and they just break down into things that naturally exist. So anyway, I don't want to get in a diatribe about that. Another question. Person says, about the sand, won't the various mulches you use, maybe excepting the seaweed, still provide protected tick habitat? After all, the rodents tend to dig around in the beds and not outside them. Still, even if there's just a 50% benefit, that is not nothing. Okay, so the person was saying it's, there's still the risk of ticks because in the beds I've got a mulch. And there's probably rodents in the beds, which there is. I've seen evidence of voles and moles in my beds. So there's still a risk of ticks because I could have the things that carry ticks are in my beds, and they're rooting around in there. So that's an excellent point. It's a really good point. And it's very possible that there are some ticks in the beds, or there's a risk of them. The difference is that I'm not kneeling and sitting and wallowing and so on and so forth in the beds. I'm kneeling or sitting or whatever I'm doing outside the bed in the sand, right? That, as far as I understand it, the ticks are not going to set up shop in that sand. That's not where they want to be, right? Basically, ticks find a habitat they like, and they sit there and they wait for a mammal to come along, and they grab onto the mammal, find a nice soft spot, where the sun doesn't shine, so to speak, to fill up on blood. So they're not going to be doing that in the sand. They're going to be in the bed. So I'm putting my hands in the bed, and I don't know if you're an outdoors person, you're constantly examining and evaluating your hands, your wrist, your forearm, and your bicep. I don't know why, but I am hypersensitive to things being on that part of my body. It's in your line of sight, and you notice your hand, your wrist, and your arms, right? You can rotate it around, you can see the whole thing, and you tend to feel things crawling on you. You've got a little bit of hair on your arm, and you can feel things moving around there. If a tick grabbed onto my hands, you'd be much more likely to notice it, even a teeny tiny tick, because it's in your line of sight, as opposed to it crawling up an ankle, grabbing onto your knee, going up your pants, climbing up your pants and going up your shirt, right? Those things you don't notice so much, and that's what happens when you're kneeling in tick habitat, and a tick grabs onto you and decides to make a meal of you. So I still don't think I'm 100% safe, but I think I'm way safer than I was. I think I'm even more than 50% safer than I was personally, because I'm sitting and kneeling in stuff where the ticks aren't, or are very unlikely to be. I mean, let's say a vole crawls across my sand. A tick isn't going to jump off of the vole to hang out in the sand. It's going to jump off of the vole in the garden bed, or probably more likely it's going to jump off the vole somewhere where other things are going to be, like a path. All you got to do is go outside my garden bed. The entire enclosure, the fenced off garden enclosure, the entire perimeter of that enclosure has what looks like to me to be a deer path going all the way around it. So deer literally walk around my garden. They walk through my garden, they walk around my garden. So let's say there's moles and voles just meandering about all over the place. My guess would be the tick would probably jump off in that area, because they're more likely to find the kind of thing they're looking for, a deer, a porcupine, a raccoon, something that's, as the tick matures, they tend to be looking for larger mammals to grab onto, a bunny rabbit, that sort of thing. So I hope that answers that question. Another question is, wonder if you find that you're going to track the sand into the house. That is a bit of a thing. I know if I'm kneeling in the sand, I tend to use a cushion to kneel on, but if you kneel in the sand, you got to bang your pants off really good. And it's a bit of a walk from my garden to my house, so a good deal of the sand, if I walk across the lawn, goes into the lawn. But I've got I tend to walk, I don't walk directly into my house, I walk into a garage. I have a garage attached to the house. I walk into the garage and I take my shoes off into the garage and I go in the house. And there is sand on the floor of the garage, and I have to sort of stay on top of it. But for the most part, we don't have sand in the house. I get sand in the garage and I stay on top of it. But yes, I wasn't tracking wood chips into the garage, and I am tracking sand into the garage, and it's created an extremely minor chore in having to stay on top of that. But it's not like every day I have to sweep the garage from top to bottom and so on and so forth. That's not the case. And actually just banging the shoes off a little bit, as you're going from the garden to the house, makes a huge difference. Another comment here is a person said, I guess I would be afraid of the rain washing the sand everywhere but where you want it. Yeah, that's a good point, and it depends on the kind of sand you've got. The kind of sand I've got, it's very coarse, and it's the kind of sand they use in septic fields. So it doesn't tend to. You have to have an incredibly powerful, strong rain for it to wash away, and you have to have a slope as well. So there's only one area of my garden which is slightly steeper than the other part of my garden, where there's signs of the sand being moved around by water collecting and running in the rain. And it really wasn't it wasn't washing the sand everywhere. It just moved the sand down the garden a little bit, and it took a few minutes with a rake to mend it. And I think that would be easily fixed by just creating a couple terraces with some logs perpendicular to the angle, the downward angle of that slope. So yeah, if you have your garden on a very steep incline, that might be an issue. If it's on a incline, it might be an issue. If it's on an extremely slight incline or decline, I wouldn't be worried about it at all. And of course, if your garden's on a flat on the level, it's not going to go anywhere. Especially if you use the septic field type. Another comment, someone said, the look, sound, and feel of wood chips will surely be missed. I wonder how much repair you'll need to do as it settles and washes. I do agree with an earlier comment with the sand clearly making your garden space appear bigger. Is that just on my phone, or do you get that feeling in person? So that's two questions. So the first one, how much repair you need to do as it settles and washes. So I've only really done that, I think, once. I had basically like a week of heavy rain, and one part of the garden there was a little bit of a canyon created, and a few minutes with a rake repaired that. Maybe once a month I might go around the whole thing and look for weeds and use a rake and just sort of level things out. I had a garden club come today to look at my garden. I spent about an hour out there this morning just going around with a rake and looking for any weeds that were growing and just sort of cleaning things up. So I would say in the 2 months since I put it down, I might have spent an hour or two in total managing the space. That's not bad for keeping it in good shape. The other question, makes the garden space look bigger? Is that just on my phone? Or do you get that feeling? And I guess I'd lump that comment in with other comments people have said about, the garden has a certain zen to it, seems bigger, it looks nice. And I would agree with all of that. I like the way it looked before, but it does seem to look bigger with the sand, and I really don't know. I have no idea why, other than sand looks uniform, so it makes the walking spaces look larger. But it is certainly pleasant to be out there in that environment, and I got a little bench where I can sit in the garden. Sometimes I'll kick off my shoes and just sit there with my bare feet and enjoy it, unless the flies are really bad. So yeah, it has given it a certain feel that's pleasing to be around. It's certainly a nice, pleasant environment when the flies aren't bad. Another question here. How would sand be compared to wood chips in terms of moisture retention? Well, this is an odd kind of question to me because I don't have sand in my garden beds. I just have it in the walking path. So I don't care about moisture retention per se in the walking paths, right? I'm not growing anything there. That water is just going down into the ground, into the water table in general, and I don't think it's affecting the water table one way or the other. I can speak to that question in terms of, I do have a garden where I grow herbs, and that garden is mulched with sand because herbs, at least in most herbs anyway, are kind of weed-like and they don't really need amazing soil. So I have a garden that's maybe 2 feet by 16 feet long, and it's got a number of different herbs in it: oregano, rosemary, thyme, things like that. And that garden's mulched with sand. There's about 3-4 inches of sand, and then there's some really, really poor clay soil underneath. And on any given day, I don't care how dry it's been for how long. If you, I'm sure if it was a desert, this wouldn't be the case. We tend to get rain every couple of weeks here, but I do not water that garden at all. And there was a garden club view of my garden today, And I showed them that if you go down a couple inches into that sand, it's wet. So if you were going to use it for a particular kind of application, I wouldn't use it for growing. I wouldn't use that as a mulch for a vegetable garden. But if you were going to use it for some kind of maybe perennial flower garden or something like that, or a perennial herb garden like I have, I think it does a great job of moisture retention. I don't want a garden at all. Haven't watered it once this year, and everything's growing great. Next question. I got about 3 more to go here. Have you ever had to deal with bindweed? What's your thoughts on getting rid of it in a raised vegetable garden? I don't know why that question's here. It has nothing to do with sand, but anyway, it was in with that category. And yeah, I do have it, and I just pick it as I see it and stay on top of it. I have it in a couple of my beds, and when I see it, I pick it. And you know, if you don't till your gardens and you keep a mulch in your garden, most weeds come out, roots and all. So if you get bindweed, if you're lucky, you get the roots out, and all I do is I pull it and throw it right back on top of the bed, and the roots dry out and the plant dies and it becomes a mulch. And that's how I deal with it. So it's not a very sophisticated answer, but that's what I just pull it and just keep pulling it. I mean, the plant's got roots in the ground, and it's going to send up greens, and it gathers its energy from the sun by virtue of the greens. So if you're to keep pulling the greens off, the roots cannot get what they need to complete the photosynthesis. So a plant can't indefinitely survive on roots alone. And roots can survive having the foliage pulled off for certain kind of plants, but the roots can't survive having the foliage removed indefinitely, right? You keep removing the foliage, eventually the roots are going to exhaust their energy stores. Anything in that matter. I mean, certain things are more tenacious than others, but eventually, if you don't let roots have any greens, the roots are just going to exhaust themselves trying to overcome that, and they will eventually die. Another question here. Oh, there are a number of questions about sand fleas. Oh, you're going to get sand fleas. Aren't you worried about sand fleas? What about sand fleas? And perhaps I've got my species wrong, or my, you know, what you're talking about. Maybe I don't understand what you're talking about here, but if you're talking about the sand fleas that are at a beach, they are a form of marine life. So my garden is not a marine environment. There's no tide coming in, and you know, it's just not the same environment. So any sand fleas that let's say I bring in a bunch of seaweed, and there's some sand fleas in that seaweed, and they get into the seaweed and say, "Oh, look, sand! Now we can be sand fleas in Greg's garden." I don't think it's going to happen, because it's not a saltwater marine beach. It's not a beach. It's just a place. It's more like a desert, right? So perhaps there's some kind of flea that loves being in the sand. I don't know, but I think these viewers are talking about those things that bite your ankles when you're at the beach, and those are a marine environment form of life. So I'm certainly not. When I go to my garden, I'm not getting bit about the ankles, and I'm out there with sandals all the time. And I'm not getting bit about the ankles by anything other than the usual things that I have in my garden: black flies, mosquitoes, horse flies, deer flies, things of that nature. This was a suggestion saying maybe a few layers of cardboard before the sand to kill the persistent weeds, especially referring to things like vetch. Yes, that does work. And outside the garden enclosure, that's exactly what I did. Outside my garden enclosure, there was no wood chips between the beds. It was just weeds. So I just weed whacked it and put cardboard down and put the sand over it, and it's done a pretty good job. I just didn't have enough cardboard to cardboard the whole garden before putting the sand down. I wish I had. That would have made a big difference. Another person was speaking to that part of the garden where the sand did run down a little bit when we had a lot of rain. It created like a little, almost like a river in the sand, and there was a small canyon. I mean, by saying canyon, I mean a canyon that was 6 inches deep. A person suggested getting some pallets, really any sort of pieces of wood, and make some break dams to terrace the garden. That's an excellent suggestion. I fully intend to do that this fall. In that area where I had that problem, I'm going to create some form of terrace to just slow down. If there is any sort of water running through the garden, you're just slowing down the speed of that water. And once the water gets a certain speed, it can carry the sand along with it. So if you slow it down and break it up, it can't do that. So And we do get a lot of rain here. And then the fall will be a good test of that because, you know, remember that Guns N' Roses song, November Rain? We get November rain here. It gets rainy here. So, yeah, it'll be a good test. I fully intend to do that, and it's a good suggestion. And I don't know if I would have come up with that without the suggestion. It just wouldn't come to mind. So thank you for that. So there's another comment here. This person said, just a heads up, our community garden had put down something similar or the same in 2015. And today, they were talking about sand. They put sand down their pathways. And today, you cannot tell it was even put there. The weeds have reclaimed the pathways. Not saying this will happen in your case, just food for thought. That's a really good suggestion. And yeah, I've had to, there's certain things that have been able to take root in my pathways. As I mentioned in the video I just did, I really think a sand depth of more like 4 or 5 inches would be better than the 2 to 3 inches that I have. So I think you need some real depth so that anything that is, any seed that germinates beneath the sand can't get up through it. And any seed that's sitting on the sand is just going to be too dry that, you know, the top 2 or 3 inches is going to be relatively dry. It's just not a good environment for germination. As opposed to what I have right now, where I've got 2 or 3 inches of sand over top of soil that had wood chips on it for years. So over top of some pretty fertile soil. I forgot to show this on the video I just did, the sand garden follow-up, but there's a couple places in the sand where I have kale growing. This would be some place in the walking path where I dropped a kale seed sometime, at some point in time, and that kale seed germinated in the soil, got up through the sand, and is now growing. So I've got 3 or 4 kale plants that are about 3 inches high growing in my sand. And I'm just leaving them alone to see, like, what is that plant going to look like this fall? You know, how big is it going to get? I don't know. I mean, my full-sized kale are almost 2 feet high, some of them right now, and these are only a couple inches high. But anyway, just out of curiosity, why not? Okay, last question, and the one question no one asked is that do you have sand in your produce? There's nothing worse than eating some food and getting that crunch, you know, when you're biting sand between your molars. You feel like you're going to break a tooth. And that has happened a couple times. The moral of the story is, if you've got sand in your pathways, don't step over the, you know, I tend to go out into the garden with a bowl. Don't step over the bowl where you're putting your food, because sand's going to fall off your shoe and get in the bowl, right? And don't lay anything you're going to eat, don't lay it on the sand. And when you bring the stuff in to your kitchen, wash it really good. And the way I wash it is I put everything in a bowl. I fill the bowl up with water. I shake all the produce really good, and I pull it out of the bowl. And then I dump the water that's in that bowl in the sink, and I fill it up again and do that whole thing again. And that seems to work really well. If I get really lazy with that process, I run the risk of there being a bit of sand in the food. So it has happened a couple times, but I would say 95% of the time it's not a thing. And if, you know, I'm really, really vigilant. I mean, the gardens where I'm growing the food, the actual beds, don't have sand in them. So it's more like when I've got a bowl and I'm not being careful and I step over the bowl with my shoes on, maybe some sand goes into it. But if you wash your stuff really good, it's not a problem. It really hasn't been a problem. I can think of 2 incidences where myself, I think it was me once and my wife once, thank goodness it wasn't my kids, became aware of there being some sand in our food. All right, so hopefully that addresses all of those questions and gives you, if you're contemplating this and you've been following along, hopefully this gives you some more to chew on if you're thinking about it. So, you know, I hope this answered all the unanswered questions and spoke to some of that. Watch those videos I've done on that, and if you're curious as well. If you enjoy listening to this podcast and you want to help support the podcast, check out the offers from my 2 sponsors, Vesey's Seeds and Safer's Gardening Products. You go in the show notes if you're on the podcast, or if you're on the YouTube channel, check out the description box. There's coupon codes. If you want to buy something from, if there's something you need that they sell, you buy it from them and help support this show and helps keep this whole thing going and offset the cost that I incur in making this content available. So I hope you enjoyed that show, and if you did, please like, share, subscribe, share this content with your friends, And until next time, get out there, get at it, have fun in your garden. Thanks for listening.